"She doesn't deserve to be called my daughter," my father shouted so loudly that his voice bounced off the courtroom walls. "She's nothing but a homeless female veteran." Every head turned toward me. I didn't move. I had spent 22 years in the U.S. Army. I'd stood through mortar attacks, sleepless nights, and enough inspections to know that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stay still. Then the judge opened the worn leather folder I had placed on his bench. He read for less than 30 seconds. His expression changed. He looked toward the bailiffs and said in a calm voice that somehow sounded louder than my father's yelling, "Lock every door. Nobody leaves this courtroom." The room froze. One bailiff immediately walked toward the double oak doors and turned the deadbolt. Another stepped into the hallway. My father's face lost its color. My mother grabbed the edge of the counsel table as if she suddenly needed something to keep her standing. Nobody understood what had just happened. Not yet. My name is Rachel Morgan. I'm 46 years old, and until that morning most people in Jefferson County knew me only as Richard Morgan's disappointing daughter. Or so they thought. If you had asked anyone in Louisville about my father, they would have smiled. Richard, wonderful man. He donates every Thanksgiving. Runs a successful construction company. Chairman of the church finance committee. The kind of man this town needs more of. He knew every city council member worth knowing. He sponsored Little League teams. He sat in the front pew every Sunday. People trusted him. They trusted him because they had only seen the version of him that wore pressed suits and polished loafers. They had never seen the man who looked at his own daughter and wished she'd never come home. The hearing that morning wasn't about some family argument. My father had gone to court asking a judge to officially remove me from the Morgan family trust forever. His attorney claimed I had abandoned the family years earlier, that I was unstable, financially irresponsible, unable to manage my own affairs. Listening to him, you'd think I had spent my life making bad decisions. The truth was a little different. I enlisted in the Army 3 months after September 11th. I was 22 years old. Dad wanted me to stay home and work in the family business. He never said it directly, but I knew he wished he'd had another son instead of me. When I signed my enlistment papers, he barely looked at me. "You'll be back," he said. "You're too stubborn to listen." Turns out I was stubborn enough to stay. 22 years, multiple deployments. Too many birthdays spent overseas. Too many names carved into memorial walls. I earned promotions one stripe at a time. Nothing was handed to me. When younger soldiers struggled, I stayed after duty hours to help them. When families lost loved ones, I stood beside them in dress uniform. The Army wasn't just my job. It became my home. Then my body finally reminded me it had limits. Years of carrying heavy gear damaged my back. An explosion during my last deployment left me with hearing problems in one ear. PTSD didn't show up all at once. It arrived quietly. A nightmare here. Anxiety there. Sleeping less. Trusting fewer people. Eventually, the Army medically retired me. I thought going home would be the easy part. I had never been more wrong. At first, things looked manageable. I found work with a defense contractor outside Fort Campbell. The pay wasn't bad. I rented a small apartment. Started physical therapy through the VA. Then the company lost a federal contract. Hundreds of us were laid off. My savings disappeared faster than I expected. Prescription copays, truck repairs, rent, groceries. Every month became a math problem I couldn't solve. I picked up security shifts, delivered groceries, drove for Uber whenever my back could handle sitting that long. Still, it wasn't enough. 1 month behind became 2. Eventually, my landlord taped an eviction notice to my door. I packed everything I owned into my old 2008 Silverado. Most people imagine homelessness as sleeping under bridges. Sometimes it looks like parking behind a Walmart where security won't bother you. Sometimes it looks like brushing your teeth in a gas station bathroom before a job interview. Sometimes it means folding your army blanket every morning because discipline is the only thing you still control. I never begged. I never asked strangers for money. Eventually, I qualified for transitional housing through a Veterans Assistance Program in Louisville. It wasn't glamorous. Shared kitchen, tiny room, paper-thin walls. But it was safe. For a while, that was enough. I called home exactly once. Mom answered. She sounded happy to hear my voice. Then Dad got on the line. "You're not coming here." That was the first thing he said. Not hello. Not how are you. Just, "You're not coming here." I wasn't asking to move in, I told him. "I just wanted to tell you what's been happening. You made your choices. I served my country. You left your family." The silence afterward hurt more than anything he actually said. Before hanging up, he added something I'll never forget. "Don't tell people you're my daughter." Click. That was the last conversation we had for almost 4 years. Over time, I heard things through relatives. Family Christmas cards no longer included my name. My childhood bedroom had become a guest room. Dad introduced my younger brother and sister as his only children. People at church assumed I'd moved away. Nobody corrected them. The strange part wasn't losing the money. It wasn't even losing the house. It was realizing how easy it had become for my own family to erase me, as if 22 years of service meant less than one season of bad luck. Still, I didn't walk into that courthouse hoping to embarrass my father. I walked in because I had learned something I couldn't ignore. Something that reached far beyond our family. Something sitting quietly inside the weathered leather folder resting on the judge's bench. And as every lock clicked shut behind us, I realized there was no turning back. Not for me, and certainly not for my father. People like to believe that families break apart because of one terrible argument. That wasn't true for mine. Mine disappeared one quiet decision at a time. Looking back now, I can't even tell you exactly when my father stopped seeing me as his daughter. Maybe it happened the day I enlisted. Maybe it happened years earlier. Maybe he had simply been waiting for an excuse. Whatever the reason, by the time I came home from the army, he had already rewritten our family's story. And in his version, I had never really belonged. Growing up, our family lived in a brick ranch house in the east end of Louisville. Dad built it himself during the late 80s. He loved reminding everyone of that. If you want something done right, he'd say do it yourself. I admired that when I was a kid. I even believed it. Saturday mornings usually started with pancakes before Dad marched my brother and me outside to work. We fixed fences, painted sheds, stacked lumber. He treated my younger brother Michael like the future owner of Morgan Construction. He always joked that I worked almost as hard as a boy. Back then I laughed with everyone else. Now I realize it wasn't really a joke. The first time I came home on leave after basic training, I was proud of my uniform. Mom cried when she saw me. Dad nodded once. Looks expensive. That was all. Every promotion after that felt the same. I'd call home with good news. Sergeant. Staff sergeant. Sergeant first class. Mom always celebrated. Dad always changed the subject. How's your brother doing? He'd ask. Business is booming. I told myself he simply didn't understand military life. Maybe that was partly true. But understanding wasn't really the problem. Respect was. After my medical retirement, I tried harder than ever to reconnect. One Thanksgiving, I bought a pumpkin pie from a Kroger bakery because I remembered Mom loved them. I drove almost 3 hours to Louisville. The pie sat on the passenger seat the whole trip. I kept imagining how surprised she'd be. Maybe we'd all sit together. Maybe we'd finally talk. When I pulled into the driveway, there were 6 cars already parked outside. The smell of turkey drifted through the cold November air. I smiled. I honestly thought maybe this was the beginning of something better. Before I reached the porch, Dad opened the front door. He didn't invite me inside. Instead, he stepped onto the porch and quietly closed the door behind him. What are you doing here? I wanted to surprise everybody. You should have called. I didn't think family needed appointments. He looked over his shoulder toward the dining room. They don't know you're here. I know, so go home. I held out the pie. I brought dessert. He didn't even look at it. Rachel, his voice stayed calm, almost polite. You're upsetting your mother. I haven't even seen her, and I'd like to keep it that way. I remember standing there with that pie growing heavier in my hands. Finally, I asked the question I'd carried for years. What did I do to make you hate me? His answer came without hesitation. You embarrassed this family. I stared at him. I served my country. You failed to take care of yourself afterward. Then he turned around, opened the door, walked back inside. I could hear everyone laughing around the dining room table before the door closed again. I stood on the porch another minute. Then I carried the untouched pie back to my truck. That was the only Thanksgiving dinner I ate that year. Sitting alone at a rest stop off Interstate 65, using a plastic fork. Things got worse after that. A cousin accidentally mentioned seeing new family pictures hanging in Dad's office. Everyone was there. Mom, Michael, my younger sister Emily, their spouses, the grandchildren, even the family dog. I wasn't. She apologized after realizing what she'd said. I told her it was fine. It wasn't. A few months later, I learned my old bedroom had become a guest suite. Every trace of me had disappeared. My trophies, high school yearbooks, even the little army plaque Mom had once displayed in the hallway. Gone. It felt strange grieving a room while knowing the people inside the house were still alive. Meanwhile, life kept moving. I worked every job I could find. Security at a warehouse outside Shepherdsville. Driving for Uber before sunrise. Cleaning office buildings downtown after everyone else had gone home. My routine rarely changed. Coffee from a Speedway gas station. Physical therapy twice a week through the VA. Counseling every Thursday afternoon. Laundry on Sundays. Job applications every evening. Some weeks I felt like I was making progress. Then my truck needed brakes. Or my prescription changed. Or another unexpected bill arrived. Every time I climbed halfway out of the hole, something pushed me back down. Still, I kept going. The Army teaches you that quitting is a habit. So is perseverance. I'd rather keep the second one. One rainy afternoon, I stopped by the Veterans Shelter kitchen earlier than usual. A gray-haired man named Frank waved me over. Frank had served in Vietnam. He always claimed the Army coffee tasted better than anything Starbucks had ever made. Nobody believed him. He didn't care. "You look tired," he said. "I've looked tired for about 3 years." He laughed. "Fair point." He slid half of his grilled cheese sandwich onto my plate. "You know," he said, "people spend too much time worrying about what they've lost." "I've lost quite a bit." "I know. So what's your advice?" Frank thought for a second. "Keep paying attention." "To what?" "Patterns." "What does that mean?" He leaned back. "Nobody gets away with the same lie forever." At the time, I thought he was talking about life in general. Months later, I'd realize he was talking about my father without even knowing it. Everything changed because of a phone call. It came from a cousin I hadn't heard from in years. "Rachel," she hesitated. "I'm sorry to tell you this." "What happened?" "It's Aunt Evelyn." My stomach tightened. "When?" "3 days ago." I closed my eyes. Nobody called me. "I know. They buried her already." A long silence. "Yesterday." I thanked her, hung up, and sat in my truck without turning the key. Aunt Evelyn had been the only person on Dad's side of the family who mailed me birthday cards every single year, even overseas, even after everyone else stopped. And somehow, I hadn't even known she'd died. That night I couldn't sleep. Something about it felt wrong. Not just cruel, wrong. 2 days later, I drove to the nursing home where she'd spent her final months. I thought I was looking for closure. Instead, I was about to find the first crack in everything my father had built. The Maple Grove Care Center sat on a quiet road just outside Louisville. It wasn't the kind of place people noticed unless they had someone inside. I parked my old Silverado beneath a maple tree that had already started losing its leaves even though it was only early October. The building looked peaceful. Flower beds, white rocking chairs on the porch, wind chimes hanging near the entrance. I wished I had visited Aunt Evelyn more often. The truth was, I thought I had more time. Most of us do. Inside, the lobby smelled like coffee disinfectant and fresh laundry. A receptionist smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "My name is Rachel Morgan. My Aunt Evelyn Carter was a resident here." The woman's expression softened. "I'm very sorry for your loss." "Thank you. I was hoping someone might tell me how she was doing near the end." She looked at her computer before making a quick phone call. A minute later, an older nurse stepped into the lobby. She was probably in her 60s with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and reading glasses hanging from a cord around her neck. "You must be Rachel." "I am." She extended her hand. "I'm Susan. I took care of your aunt." Something in her voice told me she had been waiting for this conversation. We sat outside on the porch. Susan handed me a paper cup of coffee. "I wasn't sure you'd ever come." I didn't know she was sick. She nodded slowly. "I suspected as much." I stared at the parking lot. "My father handled everything." She didn't answer right away. Instead, she reached into her sweater pocket and pulled out a small manila envelope. "Your aunt asked me to give you this." I looked at the envelope. My name was written across the front. Not printed. Written. In Aunt Evelyn's unmistakable handwriting. "I've had it for almost 5 months." My heart started pounding. "Why didn't you mail it?" "I tried," she sighed. "Your father contacted the facility and told us you wanted nothing to do with your aunt." I looked up so fast I almost spilled my coffee. "He said what?" "He claimed you had cut off all contact years ago." I couldn't even speak, Susan quietly continued. I didn't believe him. "Why?" "Because your aunt talked about you every single week." My throat tightened. "What did she say?" Susan smiled. "That you always remembered her birthday. That you wrote letters from overseas. That you were the bravest person in the family." I looked away before she could see my eyes filling with tears. For years I thought Aunt Evelyn had forgotten me. Instead, someone had been making sure we stayed apart. Susan gently touched the envelope. She made me promise. "Promise what?" "That if you ever showed up, I'd give this to you personally." I turned the envelope over. The seal had never been broken. My hands shook as I opened it. Inside was a handwritten letter, and a small brass key taped to the paper. The letter began simply, "Dear Rachel." Seeing her handwriting almost broke me. She apologized for not writing sooner. Then the words changed. "If you're reading this, it means Richard succeeded in keeping us apart." I stopped. "Read that sentence again." Then continued. "Please don't blame yourself. I tried to call you many times. He always told me you had moved. Later he said you refused to speak to me." My hands were trembling now. She continued. "Rachel, I never removed you from my will." I felt the air leave my lungs. Someone brought papers while I was heavily medicated. They told me they were medical forms. I didn't understand what I signed. I stared at the page. My aunt had underlined the next sentence twice. "Please find out what really happened." At the bottom was one final note. "The key belongs to my safe deposit box." I looked at the tiny brass key taped beside the letter. Susan had no idea what was inside. Neither did I. But suddenly I understood one thing. My father hadn't simply rejected me. He had lied to an elderly woman, possibly stolen from her, and made sure neither of us ever knew the truth. The next morning I drove to the bank listed in Aunt Evelyn's paperwork. The safe deposit box had already been frozen after her death. Fortunately, as a potential heir named in earlier estate records, I was allowed to petition for supervised access through probate procedures. It took nearly 3 weeks. Those were some of the longest weeks of my life. During that time, I couldn't stop thinking about the letter. Maybe grief was making me suspicious. Maybe there was an innocent explanation. I wanted there to be. No daughter wants to believe her father could do something like this. Finally, the probate clerk called. The judge approved limited access. I drove there the next morning. Inside the narrow metal box sat only a few items. Old family photographs, 2 pieces of jewelry, several army letters I'd mailed Aunt Evelyn from Afghanistan, and a thick envelope labeled in black ink. For Rachel only. Inside were copies, property records, trust documents, canceled checks, bank statements, everything carefully organized. My aunt had always been meticulous. One page immediately caught my attention. A transfer of nearly $800,000 from her investment account into a company I recognized instantly. Morgan Development Group, my father's company. The signature looked like Aunt Evelyn's, but something felt wrong. The slant, the spacing, the pressure. Years in the Army taught me to notice small details. This signature didn't look natural. It looked practiced. I took everything straight to Legal Aid Louisville. The attorney assigned to me was a woman named Denise Harper, probably in her early 50s. No nonsense. She wore inexpensive suits, carried a legal pad everywhere, and listened without interrupting. After nearly an hour, she folded her hands. "Rachel, I know how this sounds." "No." She looked directly at me. "It sounds serious." She slowly sorted through the papers. "I don't make accusations lightly." "Neither do I." "But if these documents are authentic," she paused. "We're not talking about a family disagreement anymore. What are we talking about?" "Possible financial exploitation of an elderly adult." The words hit harder than I expected. She continued. "We'll need experts, handwriting analysts, medical records, witnesses. This could take months. I've waited 4 years. I can wait a little longer." She smiled. "Military, 22 years." I figured. "How?" "You haven't interrupted me once." For the first time in weeks. I laughed. Only for a second. But it felt good. The investigation moved slowly, sometimes painfully slowly. Requests for records disappeared. Appointments were suddenly canceled. One witness agreed to meet us, then called an hour beforehand to say he had changed his mind. Denise frowned more with each passing week. Someone knows we're asking questions. One afternoon I walked out of the grocery store carrying 2 bags. The driver's side door of my truck was slightly open. I was certain I had locked it. Nothing expensive was missing. Just one thing. The folder containing copies of Aunt Evelyn's bank records. I sat behind the steering wheel for a long time. My heartbeat echoed inside my ears. This wasn't random. Someone knew exactly what they were looking for. And whoever it was, they were already one step ahead of us. By the time our court date arrived, I had stopped trying to imagine how it would end. For months I'd pictured every possible outcome. Maybe the judge would dismiss everything. Maybe my father would settle at the last minute. Maybe I'd lose. Maybe I'd spend another few years fighting. The only thing I knew for certain was this. I couldn't walk away anymore. Not after everything we'd uncovered. Not after learning Aunt Evelyn had spent her final months believing I had abandoned her. That thought still kept me awake at night. Jefferson County Courthouse looked exactly the same the morning of the hearing as it had every other time I'd been there. People hurried through the security checkpoint carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Deputies greeted lawyers by name. Families whispered nervously on wooden benches outside the courtrooms. Life moved on. It always does. Denise met me near the elevators. She handed me a bottle of water. You sleep at all? A little. She smiled. That's more than I expected. You nervous? I'm always nervous. You don't look it. That's because lawyers get paid to hide it. That made me laugh. She leaned closer. One more thing. What? No matter what your father says today, she paused. Ma, don't argue with him. I won't. Promise me. I promise. She nodded. Good. Dad was already inside when we entered. Dark navy suit, American flag lapel pin, perfectly knotted red tie. He looked exactly like the successful businessman Louisville admired. Mom sat beside him. She looked smaller than I remembered. Older. When our eyes met, she gave me the faintest smile. Then she looked down. Michael was there too. So was Emily. Neither of them came over. Neither looked comfortable. Dad never looked at me. He chatted with his attorney as if I weren't even in the room. Some habits never change. The hearing began promptly at 9. Judge Harold Bennett entered. Everyone stood. After the usual introductions, Dad's attorney rose first. His name was Thomas Keller. He had the smooth confidence of someone who'd spent 30 years persuading juries. He walked slowly across the courtroom. Ladies and gentlemen, he caught himself and smiled. Your Honor. A few people chuckled. He continued. This is unfortunately a very sad family dispute. He described my military career respectfully. That surprised me. Then everything changed. While Ms. Morgan's service is appreciated, he paused. May's service does not excuse years of poor judgment. He spoke about my unemployment, my PTSD, my time in transitional housing. He referred to my VA disability benefits as evidence that I struggled to function independently. Each sentence sounded reasonable on its own. Together, they painted me as someone incapable of making sound decisions. I wanted to interrupt. Denise lightly touched my arm beneath the table. I remembered my promise, so I stayed quiet. Then my father took the stand. He sounded calm, measured, almost compassionate. I love my daughter. That was how he began. I always will. I nearly laughed. Instead, I looked at the grain of the wooden table. I've tried helping Rachel for years. Another lie. But she's made choices none of us could control. He sighed dramatically. It breaks my heart. Someone sitting behind us sniffled. For a second, I wondered if they believed him. Then I realized, of course they did. He'd spent decades earning people's trust. I'd spent 4 years trying to survive. Trust is easier to keep than rebuild. Dad continued talking. He claimed Aunt Evelyn had voluntarily invested in his company, that every financial document had been properly signed, that I was inventing accusations because I wanted money. Finally, he looked directly at me. Rachel? His voice softened. You don't have to do this. The room became very still. You've suffered enough. I met his eyes for the first time all morning. So did Aunt Evelyn. His expression changed. Only slightly. But Denise noticed. I could tell because she quietly reached for the leather folder beside her chair. The judge turned toward us. Ms. Harper. Denise stood. Your Honor. We'd like to call several witnesses. The morning passed one careful step at a time. A handwriting specialist explained why Aunt Evelyn's signatures appeared inconsistent. A neurologist testified that Aunt Evelyn had been suffering significant cognitive decline during the period in question. Bank representatives authenticated financial transfers. The county recorder confirmed unusual filing patterns. Individually, none of it was enough. Together, a pattern began to emerge. Dad's attorney challenged every witness, objected whenever possible. The judge overruled most of those objections. Still, I could feel the courtroom divided. Some people believed us. Others weren't convinced. Neither was the judge. Not yet. Just after lunch, Judge Bennett looked toward Denise. Counsel? Is there anything further? Denise looked at me. I already knew what she was asking. It was time. I stood. Your Honor, I have one additional exhibit. The leather folder suddenly felt heavier than it had all morning. I walked toward the bench. Every footstep echoed across the courtroom. Nobody spoke. I placed the old folder in front of Judge Bennett. This wasn't available when discovery began. Dad's attorney immediately stood. Objection. On what grounds? We haven't reviewed. The judge raised one hand. I'll determine that. He opened the folder. Inside wasn't one piece of paper. It was the final 6 months of our investigation. A certified forensic handwriting report from an independent laboratory. Original bank documents recovered through subpoena. Church security footage showing my father entering Aunt Evelyn's room with legal paperwork after visiting hours. An affidavit from a hospice employee. Copies of phone records. a timeline prepared by Denise, and one final document, a sworn statement from a former accountant who had resigned from Morgan Development Group 3 years earlier. The accountant admitted my father had instructed him to alter internal accounting records related to Aunt Evelyn's investments. Judge Bennett read silently. No one moved. The courtroom felt strangely quiet. Even the heating system seemed to stop humming. 20 seconds. 30. 40. He removed his reading glasses. Read one page again. Then looked toward the bailiffs. His voice was calm, almost unsettlingly calm. Bailiffs! Both deputies immediately looked up. Lock every door. Silence. No one leaves this courtroom until further order. For a heartbeat, nobody understood. Then the deputies moved. The heavy wooden doors closed. Locks clicked into place. Judge Bennett looked directly at my father's attorney. It appears this court may have been presented with credible evidence of ongoing felony fraud, possible witness intimidation, and perjury. Dad's attorney slowly sat down. He leaned toward my father and whispered just loudly enough for those of us nearby to hear. Richard, he swallowed. Don't say another word. Dad's face had turned completely white. Mom covered her mouth with both hands. Behind us, I heard someone whisper, "Oh my God." For the first time in years, the most powerful man in my family looked genuinely afraid. And somehow, I knew the hardest part was still ahead. No one spoke after the judge ordered the doors locked. The silence wasn't dramatic. It was uncomfortable. The kind of silence that settles over a room when everyone realizes they've been looking at the same picture, but suddenly someone turns on the light. Judge Bennett closed the leather folder and looked toward the clerk. I'd like the record to reflect that Exhibit 21 has been received pending authentication. He turned to my father's attorney. Mr. Keller, does your client wish to respond before I determine the next procedural step? Thomas Keller didn't answer immediately. He was reading the affidavit from the former accountant for what had to be the third time. Finally, he leaned toward my father again. I couldn't hear everything this time. Only 3 words. Don't improvise, Richard. For the first time in my life, my father looked uncertain. The judge called our first witness after lunch, Dr. Melissa Grant. She specialized in forensic handwriting analysis and had testified in state and federal courts for nearly 20 years. She wasn't flashy. She spoke quietly, methodically. She projected enlarged copies of Aunt Evelyn's signatures onto a screen. Then she placed genuine signatures beside the questioned ones. You'll notice the hesitation marks here, she explained. She pointed with a laser. Mrs. Carter normally signed her name in one continuous movement. She moved the pointer. The questioned signatures contain multiple pauses. Another slide appeared. The pressure pattern changes. Another. The angle changes. Another. The letter spacing becomes mechanically consistent. Judge Bennett leaned forward. So your opinion? Dr. Grant answered without hesitation. These signatures were not written naturally by Evelyn Carter. Within a reasonable degree of professional certainty. Yes, Your Honor. Dad's attorney cross-examined her for almost 40 minutes. She never changed a single answer. Next came the neurologist, then a representative from the bank. Each testimony added another small piece. None of them alone proved everything. But together, the puzzle was beginning to look complete. Still something was missing. The human story. Then Denise called someone I hadn't expected. Michael Morgan. My younger brother slowly walked toward the witness stand. The room became noticeably quieter. Dad's head snapped toward him. Michael wouldn't meet his eyes. He took the oath. Sat down. His hands were shaking. I hadn't spoken to him in almost 3 years. The last time we'd seen each other was at our cousin's wedding. He'd smiled awkwardly. We'd exchanged maybe 10 words. Now he looked like he hadn't slept in days. Denise spoke gently. Mr. Morgan, how long did you work for Morgan Development Group? Almost 18 years. What was your position? Operations manager. Who supervised you? My father. She nodded. Were you ever instructed to destroy company records? Michael closed his eyes. For several seconds he didn't answer. Judge Bennett looked over his glasses. You may answer. Michael took a long breath. Yes? The courtroom stirred. Dad immediately leaned toward his attorney. Thomas Keller placed a hand on Dad's arm without taking his eyes off Michael. What kind of records? Denise asked. Financial files. Related to whom? My aunt. Aunt Evelyn. When? Over several years. Did you destroy them? Another long silence. Yes. Why? Because my father told me to. My stomach tightened. Not because I was surprised. Because I could hear how ashamed he sounded. Denise walked a little closer. Why are you telling the court this today? Michael looked at me for the first time. I've been lying to my sister for years. Then he looked back at the judge. I kept telling myself Dad knew what he was doing. I told myself it wasn't my business. I told myself family comes first. He swallowed hard. But Aunt Evelyn loved Rachel. She talked about her constantly. I knew that. I still helped hide things. His voice cracked. I'm done lying. There wasn't a dry eye on the jury benches reserved for public observers. Even the court reporter paused for a second before continuing to type. Dad suddenly stood. He's lying. Thomas Keller grabbed his sleeve. Richard. No. Dad pointed across the courtroom. She's turning everyone against me. Judge Bennett looked up sharply. Mr. Morgan, sit down. I won't sit here while my own son... Sit. Dad ignored him. He jabbed a finger toward Michael. You ungrateful little fool. I gave you everything. Michael lowered his head. You gave me orders. Dad turned toward me. And you? His face was red now. You've always wanted to destroy this family. I slowly stood. No. I spoke quietly. I wanted to be part of it. The room fell silent again. Dad laughed bitterly. You expect anyone to believe that? I looked directly at him. I drove 3 hours one Thanksgiving with a pumpkin pie. You wouldn't even let me inside. His mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't expected me to remember. I called Mom after I lost my apartment. You told me not to tell people I was your daughter. Still nothing. You buried Aunt Evelyn without telling me. You erased me from family photographs. You told everyone I walked away. I took one slow breath. I never walked away. You pushed me out. Dad slammed both hands on the table. She's manipulating all of you. Judge Bennett struck his gavel once, hard. Mr. Morgan. Dad kept talking. This court has no idea who she really is. Another strike. Louder. Enough. Dad turned toward the judge. You believe a homeless veteran over me. The words echoed across the courtroom. The judge's expression hardened. I believe evidence. For several seconds, nobody moved. Then Judge Bennett looked toward the prosecutor seated in the gallery. I am referring this matter to the Commonwealth's attorney for review of potential criminal charges, including forgery, financial exploitation of a vulnerable adult, destruction of evidence, witness intimidation, and perjury. He turned another page. As for today's civil matter, he paused. This court finds sufficient cause to suspend all disputed trust modifications pending further proceedings. He looked directly at me. Ms. Morgan, you will be restored as an interested beneficiary until the validity of those documents is fully resolved. I hadn't realized I'd been holding my breath. It escaped all at once, not relief, not happiness, just release. Outside the courthouse, television cameras were already gathering. Someone must have tipped off the local news. Microphones appeared the moment I stepped onto the courthouse steps. One reporter asked the question everyone wanted answered. Ms. Morgan, after everything that's happened today, do you feel like you've finally gotten revenge? I looked back toward the courthouse doors. Deputies were escorting my father to another room for questioning. For a moment, I saw not the powerful businessman everyone admired, just an aging man who had spent years protecting lies instead of people. I turned back to the reporter. This was never about revenge. She looked surprised. I continued. It was about telling the truth long enough that someone finally believed it. As the cameras clicked around me, I caught sight of someone standing quietly near the edge of the crowd. Frank, the Vietnam veteran from the shelter. He didn't wave. He simply smiled. Then he gave me a small salute. I returned it. And for the first time since leaving the army, I truly felt seen. 3 months after the hearing, life became strangely quiet. After spending nearly a year buried in depositions, medical records, bank statements, and courtroom dates, I woke up one Monday morning with nowhere I had to be. No lawyer waiting for a phone call. No investigator asking another question. No hearing circled on my calendar. Just silence. I made coffee in the tiny kitchen of the Veterans Transitional Housing Center where I'd been living. Frank was already there reading yesterday's newspaper with a pair of drugstore reading glasses perched halfway down his nose. He looked over the paper. Well, he said, I guess you're famous. I laughed. I'd rather be anonymous. Too late. He folded the newspaper and slid it across the table. There I was, not on the front page. Page 3. A small photograph outside Jefferson County Courthouse. The headline read, Local Court Orders Investigation into Elder Financial Abuse Case. No mention of revenge. No mention of family drama. Just facts. For the first time, that was enough. The criminal investigation moved forward on its own. I wasn't part of every meeting anymore. The Commonwealth's attorney's office took over. Detectives interviewed former employees from Morgan Development Group. Financial records were subpoenaed. Several additional elderly investors came forward after seeing the news. Apparently, Aunt Evelyn hadn't been the only person who trusted my father with her finances. That realization hurt almost as much as everything else, because it meant this hadn't been one terrible decision. It had become a habit, a way of life. Several months later, Richard Morgan resigned from every board he served on. His church quietly removed him from its finance committee. The construction company he'd spent 40 years building announced it was closing after lenders withdrew their support. People around Louisville talked about it for weeks. I didn't. There wasn't anything left to say. The probate court eventually ruled that the changes made to Aunt Evelyn's trust were invalid. Her original estate plan was restored. I received the portion she had intended to leave me all along. It wasn't millions. It wasn't enough to change the world, but it changed mine. The first thing I did wasn't buy a new truck, or take a vacation, or replace every piece of furniture I'd lost over the years. Instead, I paid every debt I still owed, every medical bill, every credit card, every overdue balance. Watching those numbers disappear felt better than buying anything ever could. Then I started looking for a home. Not a mansion, not even a large house, just somewhere peaceful. I found it outside Clarksville, Tennessee, only a short drive from Fort Campbell. A modest ranch-style home with 2 bedrooms, a small front porch, and an old oak tree in the backyard. The paint needed work. The fence leaned a little. The kitchen cabinets were outdated. It was perfect. The first night I slept there, I woke up at 3 in the morning out of habit. For years I'd been listening for strangers walking past my truck, or doors opening in the shelter hallway. This time, the only sound was the wind moving through the oak tree. I smiled. Then I went back to sleep. A few weeks later, Frank came over carrying a toolbox. I heard homeowners always need free labor. I thought you were retired. I am. Then why are you working? He grinned. Because you're buying lunch. We spent the afternoon repairing the fence. Neighbors waved as they walked their dogs. A little boy riding his bicycle stopped to ask Frank if he'd really been in the army. Frank looked offended. Young man, I was in the army before your father was born. The boy's eyes grew wide. Frank winked at me after he rode away. You've got to have fun while you're getting old. That became one of my favorite afternoons. No lawyers, no judges, just 2 veterans fixing a fence that probably didn't need fixing. Not long after moving in, I met with a local nonprofit that helped women veterans transition back into civilian life. They needed volunteers, mentors, people willing to sit across a table from someone who believed life was over and quietly say, I've been there. I understood that feeling, so I said yes. Every Thursday afternoon, I started meeting with women who reminded me of myself a few years earlier. Some struggled with PTSD, others had lost jobs, a few were living in their cars. We didn't always solve their problems. Sometimes we just shared coffee. Sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, a young Marine Corps veteran asked me, What made you keep going? I thought about it for a moment. Then I answered honestly. I stopped waiting for the people who hurt me to become the people who could heal me. She wrote that down. I hope it helped. One October afternoon, someone knocked on my front door. When I opened it, my mother was standing there. She looked nervous, older than I remembered. She held a plain white envelope with both hands. I wasn't sure you'd answer. I almost didn't. She nodded. I know. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, I stepped aside. You'd better come in. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table Frank had helped me carry inside. Mom slid the envelope toward me. I found these. Inside were photographs, dozens of them. Birthday parties, camping trips, Christmas mornings. One showed me at 12 years old wearing a fishing hat that was much too big. Dad had his arm around my shoulders. We were both laughing. I stared at it for a long time. He kept these in his office, Mom whispered. I didn't know. You really didn't? She shook her head. Rachel. Tears filled her eyes. I should have stood up for you. I was afraid. I believed her. Not because fear excused what she'd done. Because I'd seen fear before. In soldiers. In civilians. In myself. Fear makes ordinary people stay silent. Sometimes for years. She reached across the table. I'm sorry. I covered her hand with mine. I can't get those years back. I know. But I don't want to lose whatever years we have left. Neither did I. Forgiveness didn't happen in one conversation. It never does. But that afternoon something began. That was enough. Sometimes people ask whether I hate my father. The honest answer is no. Hate takes energy. And after everything that happened, I decided I wanted to spend mine differently. I spent too many years believing justice meant watching someone else lose. Now I know better. Justice is waking up without fear. It's telling the truth even when your voice shakes. It's building a life no one else gets to erase. If this story reminded you that dignity is something no one can take from you, unless you surrender it yourself, I hope you'll share it with someone who might need that reminder today. And if you'd like to hear more stories about resilience, family, and second chances, I'd be honored to have you back. Thank you for listening.